Memory loss, dementia, Alzheimer's. Those are not things that most people want to think about happening to them, but it's all too common. The treatments haven't been available anyway, so it seems like a lot of worry for nothing. But my guest today has a different perspective, focused on empowering patients and caregivers in Alzheimer's prevention through cognitive health promotion and early detection to enhance patient outcomes in mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the Health Biz Podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. My guest today is Tom O'Neill, CEO of Cognivue. If you enjoy this episode, please press that like button and subscribe. Tom, welcome to the Health Biz Podcast.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
So we're going to do a memory test of sorts here. It's nothing as fancy as what you've got and ask you about your childhood. I guess those are the last memories to fade anyway. But in this case, I want to ask you a little bit about your upbringing and any childhood influences that have stuck with you.
Yeah. So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio on the west side. So a Midwestern boy, one of three sons. And, I grew up in a blue collar town, blue collar house. My dad worked for the local electric company. My mom was a medical transcriber. So it was interesting. My dad would literally go to work from 7 a.m. till 5 p.m. And my mom would go to work from 5 p.m. till 1 a.m, Monday through Friday. And so, we grew up, listen, we didn't want for anything. They always made sure we had what we needed. You want to talk about influencers. It was both of them. Yeah. Right. They were the key influencers in my life.
And then what did you do for education past high school? What did you think you wanted to be? What did you end up studying?
Yeah, it's an interesting story, and I'll give you a little perspective. So in high school, I wasn't exactly the best student, okay, and maybe known more for having fun than studying. And so when I went to college, I went to Cleveland State my first year, and it felt like senior high school. It was living at home, going to school, coming home, still cutting the grass, washing the cars for my dad. And then I quit and I dropped out and I went and was a full-time furniture mover, truck driver. And I remember coming home one day and it was a 16-hour day. It was a brutal day in the middle of the summer. And I got home at 1. I had to go back in at 6. And my dad said, "You know what?" He said, "You could have spent 6 or 8 hours at the library at school and done a lot better for yourself and wouldn't be, in his words, humping triple dressers up 3 flights of stairs when you're 40 years old."
Yeah.
So I'm like, as much as I didn't agree with him at the time, he's smart. So I ended up going back to school, went to University of Akron. And I think it was at kind of that turning point for me because listen, David, at best, I was a 2-3 student in high school. But something changed and something just clicked. And I wanted to do better. I wanted to do more. And so I went and started I was a 3.8 student my first semester down at Akron. But I think it was also living away, feeling the experience, but also kind of wanted to prove people wrong, wanted to prove that I could do it. So I ended up getting a business degree, an undergraduate Bachelor of Science in business administration and marketing.
I see sometimes people are advised now to take kind of a gap year, and it's a sort of a similar philosophy, which is that you go out, if you just go straight on to school, it's sort of like you take it for granted. And, by the way, the parents, your parents, on the one hand, they were working 16 hours a day, but it also meant you had coverage the other time because somebody wasn't working. So you were being, somebody had an eye on you. You go to school all of a sudden, whatever. I won't speak for, what you were up to. But then actually, when you've got that experience, sometimes in consulting, we call it the self-discovered logic. It's like, 3 stories or maybe 4 stories, you're going to be humping the dressers up there. So then you can really go in and apply yourself because you're doing it because you want to do it. Yeah. What it sounds like. So.
Yeah, it really, and it helps me now because I mentor a lot of senior professionals, but also young professionals coming out of college. And I think everybody's in this race. Yeah. And I try to explain to them it's not a race, it's a journey. Now I'm 54, so I actually have some experience to be able to say it, but I understand where they were. I was similar when I got out of school, but but I want everybody to kind of slow down, enjoy what they're going through, because it matters. The older they get.
Now, I see, obviously we're going to talk about healthcare today, and that's mostly the focus for the podcast here. And
Sure.
you've got some stints at healthcare, well-known healthcare companies. But I also see one for, I think, the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco.
Yeah.
How did that start off?
So I started when I was in college. Well, one of my best friend's dad was the sales manager at Nabisco. So I started working as a merchandiser during school. Then as I got closer to graduation as a summer intern, and then once I graduated, they ended up making me a full-time offer. So I started off in consumer packaged goods with Nabisco. But if you think about it, my foray from Nabisco into Johnson and Johnson was also in CPG and consumer packaged goods. So I went from cookies and crackers to Tylenol and Motrin and Imodium. So it was just a different CPG business. It was OTC, over the counter medications, rather than cookies and crackers.
Gotcha. All right, so there's a logic to it. But then somewhere you got into healthcare. Now, how about Bausch and Lomb? What was that about?
Yeah, so I'll actually even give you a little bit different perspective, because most people you talk to kind of grow up in one vertical, right?
Yeah.
In one world. And I'm a bit of that tweener, is how I define it, right? So 30 years in healthcare, but everything from consumer healthcare to pharmaceuticals, to vision care, and contact lenses and vitamins and drops, to surgical equipment, chemistry, immunohematology at Orthoclinical Diagnostics, then molecular diagnostics and life sciences, and ultimately here at Cognivue, where we're as much a medical device company in neurology as we are a tech company.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's talk about Cognivue, but in terms of just cognition, let's talk about that. And there's a lot of CO words here. So concussions. Yes, there's a lot of emphasis on concussions. Certainly, we see it when we're talking about professional athletes, football players, and so on. But also just kids playing high school
Yeah.
football or hockey, or just stuff that happens even not through sports. And you think about, okay, at the time you get a concussion, you recover from it, and so on.
Right.
As you get toward your age and my age, and I'm even a little bit ahead of you,
Yeah.
what are we seeing in terms of those concussions, and what sort of an impact that may have long term on cognition? Any connection there between what happens earlier and what happens later on?
Yes. So a couple of things. There's definitely a clinical connection between concussions, TBIs, and concussion versus traumatic brain injury, and longer term impacts, especially when it's multiple concussions over and over again. So we've worked closely. His name's Dr. Jeff Kutcher at the Kutcher Clinic. It's out of Michigan, and he's easily one of the world's renowned sports neurologists. He works with the U.S. Olympic downhill ski, the snowboarding team, the NFLPA, the NHLPA, and he's been using our technology for 4 or 5 years. And it's not necessarily that we're a concussion test by ourselves. We're not. We're a cognition test as it relates to concussion, right? So a lot of what you see, David, on the market are concussion tests. Those are
Right.
FDA approved concussion tests. But I don't think they necessarily go deep enough into the cognition, into mild cognitive impairment. So, ours is a deeper test or assessment, if you will, to give the doctor a better understanding of how that athlete, whether it's a student athlete or whether it's a professional athlete, how that athlete is progressing to being able to be back on the field. But to your question, I don't know that there's the direct correlation to long term. I mean, you hear about CTE
Yeah.
in football players and professional football players and other stuff. So I think there's clearly a correlation to it. I don't think you'd be able to talk to a doctor or a neurologist that wouldn't believe that. But I do think it matters. And I think it also matters to understand, if you do get a concussion, when is the right time? If you're going to go back on the field or on the court, or the ice, when is the right time to do that? And that's where you lean on the professionals, the sports neurologists, to help figure that out.
Tom, when I think about cognition, certainly I worry about, I see older people. I know people even my age that have cognition issues. And I hear sometimes about people saying, well, let's do an assessment, cognitive assessment. And I guess from my standpoint, even though I believe in the scientific method and all that. I sometimes think, well, what you don't know can't hurt you. And then even on the other side, what you do know might not help you if they're just going to say, yeah, you're probably going to get Alzheimer's early. So it's like, now I should start. Why don't I start worrying then as opposed to now? But what's the kind of the value, and do you see potential downsides of doing an early
Yeah.
assessment?
So first off, I think it's a great question, and I hear it a lot, but I'll give you a couple things. So first off, in the real world experience before COVID hit, we used to do employer health fairs. You in the cafeteria, there's 20 tables set up, a lot of different vendors that come in and do different types of things, testing and education and other stuff for the employees of that company. Well, we started getting hired by HR within these different organizations. And I mean everything from companies in Silicon Valley to Waste Management to Cleveland Clinic to local, car dealerships and other stuff that would do this. We'd bring 4 devices.
Yeah.
Okay. And they would run the 5-minute screening, 4 devices. Now, generally, these health fairs are 3 hours long. Okay. 3 to 4 hours long. We would have to stay an extra 90 minutes to 2 hours at every single one of those events, not bar none. All 52 that we did before COVID, every single one, we had a waiting list of people that wanted to come in and be screened. And so when that would, now kind of fast forward to this idea of what can I do, right? Because when we talk to primary care doctors, many of them don't do enough cognitive screening or cognitive assessment. And I think the reason being is the reason they tell us is they got to see patients every 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
They don't have time. There's no prescription they can write for it. And if they do the assessment, sometimes the payers make it difficult for them to get reimbursed for their time. And I explained to the doctors, I'm like, I get that. I really understand. And they also say, we already counsel our patients about diet, exercise, and stuff. And I go, I get that. I really do understand that. But there's an inflection point here. So I didn't start taking my Lipitor and start watching my diet until I saw my numbers. Until I saw my cholesterol numbers. I think the same thing holds true. Like people, there are things they can do. They call it the modifiable risk factors. So the World Health Organization, the CDC Healthy Brains Initiative, the Lancet, they've all come out and said diet, exercise, lifestyle, mindfulness, hearing, cardiovascular, all these things matter. And if we take care of those things early on, you could slow or stop the progression of MCI, mild cognitive impairment, before it becomes something more permanent. And now you got a report that makes it more meaningful to you. I think the other thing, David, is I don't know many people who haven't seen or been touched by dementia up to and including Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So whether it's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, or uncle, when we see that, we call the caregivers or the children of the caregivers the worried well.
Yeah.
So they wonder whether I have that or I'm gonna have that one day. And if you empower them by giving them data and then also actions they can take, and now recently the FDA just approved the drug for mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's. Now there's something they can do about it.
Yeah.
But for us, it's really those modifiable risk factors that make a difference.
Now, Tom, you're talking about, I'm just going to jump on something else you said about sort of, before the pandemic, health fairs, people lining up and so on and so forth. Obviously, a lot of things changed with COVID, one of which was just the sort of quick shift to digital health and remote monitoring and so on. And have you been part of that, or are we still talking about a kind of an in-person, kind of an exercise?
Yeah. So our technology is in person. And I think there's real value in that, right? So not to get into super technical stuff, but when, and we're working towards mobile apps and mobile tablets and other things will do some cognitive assessment on those too. But the reality is when you go into the doctor and it's in the right healthcare setting, it's not, and I'll use my mom and dad as an example. They're both 79. If a tablet or a phone is something that you ask my 79-year-old parents to hold and use their other hand to take a test with, they're going to have difficulty with that from
Right.
a motor skill. If like our technology measures every 1/12 of a second, so in 10 minutes we get 130,000 data points. If during that 10-minute assessment they had to, like, there was a glare from the lights,
Yeah.
if they had to look around, on the tablet itself, and they're going to miss seconds in being
Right.
able to get to an answer, it all of a sudden starts to have an impact. So there is really something to there's real value in having, mobile
Yeah.
technology, mobile
You don't need
tools.
to go to you don't need to go to all the effort, in other words, to tell you that older people sometimes have more difficulty manipulating the latest device. That's not going to be there. Related to that, though, is you mentioned, like, when you didn't start taking your Lipitor until you see your numbers. Now, it's still, the lipid profile is still like slightly complicated, but it's not nearly as complicated as trying to understand cognition. And I
Sure.
think one of the big issues just has to do with just the differences among healthy individuals, even that are all sort of similar, and then what's the normal aging, versus an actual deficiency. And my understanding, it's been hard to sort that out, especially if it's not something that you're having, every year. You didn't necessarily have a baseline assessment. How do you think about, you know, how someone reads that report? Is it just that, wow, I got this report and I've got some reds and yellows on it, I better actually, take it seriously? Or how do you deal with this sort of baselining
Yeah.
question?
So first off, I think we as a country, but as a healthcare across the country, but the world needs to do more with regards to cognitive screening. Our technology is going to tell you, all the technologies are going to tell you, the DCAs, the digital cognitive assessments, are going to tell you where you are with your cognitive function at that moment. Um, do you need a baseline? Not necessarily, right? I think that's what we give you, and we
Yeah.
give you and all the technologies do. They give you versus a normative range, so they'll know by your age or your sex at birth or your ethnicity where you should be, and then it tests you against that. So what I do think is, almost think of it as the fifth vital sign, right? There should be a really regular conversation with your doctor where they're testing MCI. We know that Alzheimer's doesn't just show up. It takes
Yeah.
decades to build that up. I think it's very complex, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to pretend to give you all the detail on this. But if you think about Alzheimer's, it's really three things: it's inflammation, circulation, and toxins. Inflammation, circulation, and toxins. So if you think of those, even when one drug comes out, like Leqembi, it's removing that protein buildup, right? The plaques and tangles in the brain, but that's only one element. This is going to take a very different approach um, to curing Alzheimer's one day. But I think it starts with where you started the question, which is, if you're screening regularly and early, and you catch it when it's mild cognitive impairment, and by the way, it could be many things, right, David? It could be the medication you're on. It could be a concussion, like you had mentioned earlier in the show. It could be that you're smoking, or you're maybe not taking care of yourself. If you understood that those had impact on your long-term brain health and capacity, you may change how you live your life for the benefit of longevity, um, more so than you would have before, because maybe, again, you've seen mom or dad or grandma or grandpa been through it.
So you mentioned a couple of drug approvals last, or I guess a couple of years ago, we had Aduhelm that was
Mhm.
approved, but then not approved for
Right.
reimbursement by Medicare. Cost the FDA commissioner, acting commissioner, her job and career
Right.
probably.
Yeah.
And now you've got Leqembi, which seems to potentially actually work somewhat, and it's a little bit less expensive, and maybe doesn't have as many side effects. At the same time, it's awfully pricey, and the impact is going to be modest enough that most people probably won't be able to really detect it. And we're just talking about a slowdown. So I'm sort of answering my question as I'm asking it, but you mentioned more impact, more investment maybe needs to be made on the earlier side, maybe on the screening and the lifestyle modification, because
Sure.
for the 20 some thousand, whatever it's going to be for a year of Leqembi, there's a lot of lifestyle modification. You could impact a lot of people,
Yeah.
for that. It doesn't help somebody who's already, at that a later stage, but you should be
Sure.
able to have a bigger impact up front. What's your view sort of from a public health standpoint about how sort of the tie-in between early assessment, lifestyle modifications, versus longer term treatments? How should that balance be
Yeah.
adjusted?
So I think it should always start with, before it turns to medication, it always start with screening, empowerment, knowledge, and then the modifiable risk factors, the things that you can control. I also think, and even if you look back at Biogen's drug, and now with Eisai's drug with Biogen, Leqembi, um, they're really breaking ground.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to look at these drugs as the end all. I think it's really the opportunity that finally, for the millions and millions of patients that have very real concerns about progressing from MCI to Alzheimer's, or from early Alzheimer's to full blown Alzheimer's, it gives them the first opportunity to treat themselves and it's not insignificant, right? So you had mentioned cost, but cost is just one factor, right? So it's $26,000. We'll see what CMS comes out, and we
Yeah.
think they'll cover, but there will be a pretty significant copay. But even then, if you have millions of patients that want to try this, our health system isn't ready to do it, from
No.
policymakers to health systems to payers to the providers. So there's going to be bottlenecks along the way. And we have to work closely with the health systems to figure that out. We have to work closely with the payers to figure it out. Give you an example. Besides the cost, and that there's not enough neurologists or neuropsychs to be able to screen all these patients, because it's so expensive, and because the side effect profile is not insignificant. There's
Yeah.
brain bleeds and swelling of the brain. They're going to want to have a prior authorization process that includes a screening like Cognivue, includes some blood biomarkers, maybe even a PET scan and some other neuropsych workup. Those are all steps that can only be taken through a specialist, not through primary care. And even then, let's say you have a radiologist that has done a PET scan. There's only a limited number of radiologists that really understand how to look for the amyloid at the stage the amyloid needs to be in to benefit from Leqembi. And then ultimately it goes to an infusion center where you're getting 2 infusions a month, 1 hour each time. And it's going to take, there's going to be MRIs involved because they're going to want to make sure there's no negative side effects. So the reason why I say all that is it goes back to the first comment, which is empower and control what you can control. If you're on the medication, remember, this isn't going to be the first. There are 15 different molecules that are in phase 3, which is the last step before they get approved, phase 3 trials. And 15 of those, or just about all of those, are expected to get approved in the next 4 years. And they're going to get better and better as we go. So they're not going to be just stuck on the 27% improvement in Leqembi
Yeah.
or the 35% improvement with Lilly's drug. They're going to continue to improve both the side effect profile and the efficacy.
To go back to what I had said before, perhaps if not unfairly, but without the fuller context about the Aduhelm approval, is that I think what FDA was considering was there's been a lot of investment here, and we've got something that is changing a biomarker that we think should work, and we're not just looking at this drug, we're looking at everything that's in the pipeline, and we don't want to give a signal to the investors to say, hey, we know you spent billions of dollars on this, but we're going to have a standard that's so high that you're not going to be able to surmount it. And I think there is a broader public policy issue at stake, but of course it has to be done at the level of an individual drug approval, and then Medicare is looking at it from that standpoint as well. I want to touch on a little bit what you were talking about, how the healthcare system's not ready, to be able to administer Leqembi as an example. And I think, in your role, you won't be able to unblock every element of that
Sure.
chain. One of them, though, maybe does relate to primary care. So if you think about, there's not enough neurologists, but also what happens is that those that are being referred, sometimes those referrals are not appropriate or not necessary. or they're not efficient in the sense that you've referred to the wrong neurologist or the wrong specialist in general. And in working with primary care, are you able to help empower primary care to do more, sometimes maybe not to refer, or to make those referrals when they're most appropriate and so on, that might help at least one element of that whole chain?
Yeah, listen, I think that would be the ultimate goal, right? To get primary care involved. I think until until we get to that level, until we get to that point, yeah, I think it's going to sit with the neurologists, the neuropsychs, and geriatricians who have been taught to be able to identify and diagnose Alzheimer's. So I think that's where it's going to sit. But the only way we're going to be able to take care of the millions of patients is it's got to start in primary care.
Yeah.
But in order for it to start in primary care, things have to change, and things have to change either from a payer side or even just how do you see a patient in 10 minutes and get through everything that they need to do. I have a lot of friends who are primary care, internal medicine, or family practice docs. They're great docs. They care about their patients. They are not looking to push the patients off, but they are under pretty strict requirements of how many patients they need to see and get through. Things are going to have to change. And I keep explaining Alzheimer's is not just a healthcare issue, but a society issue. And we have to figure that out. We, as Cognivue, we started broadening the screening class to include audiologists, some optometrists, retail pharmacists, because we know it can't all just rest in the very traditional channels. It's going to be needed. Screening is going to be needed across the board. And then allowing those clinicians to intervene how they can against the modifiable risk factors. Audiologists, we know hearing is one of the most modifiable risk factors. And people generally take about 7 years to get hearing aids when they should have gotten them earlier. So if we can help an audiologist have a much bigger, broader healthcare conversation with that patient, that then takes that patient to a point of where they take action sooner, great for the benefit of that patient. Same with optometry, same with pharmacy. Impact what they can, but if they can't do any more than that, then they refer them to an MD.
Gotcha. So we've talked a lot about cognition and the issues in the market overall, and a little bit about Cognivue and what you do. As you look at your business, how do you see the main kind of opportunities and challenges over the next, say, 3 years or so, given everything that's happened in the market to date?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting time in the market for the patients. I think there are going to be patients that want to get access to not only Leqembi, but the drugs that are going to come out in the future. I think, again, part of that's going to be this prior authorization process, which is going to include some type of cognitive screening on the front end. It may be AI driven, and then it may be in the office with a technology like Cognivue, blood biomarkers, and PET scans and other things. As the systems work through those, we're working closely and talking a lot with them to make sure that we're working through those challenges and those issues together, because I don't think it's going to be one size fits all. So I think it's going to take a year or two to actually figure some of that stuff out, maybe even longer, depending on the other drugs, because it's going to move, I would think, pretty quickly from infusions to injections.
Yeah.
Which will lend itself to other challenges, but will also lend itself to maybe a broader patient base that can have access to it. The good thing for us is, since we are in that screening and assessment space, it's starting to become a regular conversation, where when I started here at Cognivue 5 years ago, it wasn't, right? It was not something that was regularly discussed, but it is now a topic of conversation with every health system.
So, Tom, I know your dad mentioned you should spend 6 to 8 hours in the library per day, presumably,
Yeah.
and I'm assuming you're not able to do that at this point. But have you had a chance to find any books that you like, and any books that you would recommend? Or I always ask also, anything you would recommend to avoid?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So for me, there's plenty of business books out there, and certainly that's where I kind of focus my attention. But one of the ones is called Built Not Born, Built Not Born by Tom Golisano, and Tom is the owner of our company. But he also founded the company called Paychex. It's a payroll services company, and he's got, call it another 15 to 17 companies out of his family office that he either is the primary shareholder in, or the investor in, or the full investor in. And what I love about working with Tom, but also with that book, Built Not Born, is it's a practical guide for an entrepreneur who wants to build a business. It isn't theoretical. It isn't, got stuff that's sitting at 30,000 feet. He gets really into the nuts and bolts of what's needed to be successful. And he does that through his experiences. So that's the one I'd recommend.
Well, he has I think, a good reputation. And also, I think his wife is Monica Seles, if I'm not
She is.
mistaken.
Yep.
And
She's a great
he's
lady. Yep.
certainly a good force there. Well, that is terrific advice. I'll get that from my library shelf. I want to say thank you, Tom O'Neill, CEO of Cognivue. We've been talking about cognition. We've been talking about testing, early intervention, and what we can do with the modifiable risk factors. Tom, thank you so much for joining me today on the Health Biz Podcast.
Great. Thanks, David. I appreciate the time.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.